So this is the session, the short session. So we'll have first Ashley Neely from Osaka University talking about podcasts, the new frontier of blended spoken and written speech modality. Ashley, when you're ready, pick it up.
Okay, great. So are you guys avid listeners of podcasts? Would you say like once a week, on a daily basis?
Daily, if I can.
Daily. Okay, great. I also listen to podcasts on a daily basis for news and entertainment. And I also teach a class at my university in Japan, Osaka University, called the Audio Renaissance, where we listen to excerpts of podcasts while reading through the transcript, followed by a discussion of the content. So in most cases, I've generated this transcript myself, which just goes to say I consume a lot of podcast media. And in the course of all my listening, I began to notice the occurrence of an unusual type of expression showing up in people's interviews and conversations, that is initialisms like WTF, IDK, TLDR, that originated in written computer-mediated communication, but had crossed over into the spoken lexicon. And I didn't observe this in my casual conversations, generally speaking. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. This is also, by the way, a work in progress. It's a totally new kind of question and subfield that I'm foraying into. So I'll appreciate your comments or critiques or suggestions at the end. So I thought, okay, let's figure out what's going on here. And I began to kind of dig into the literature on CMC, computer-mediated communication, to see if anyone was looking at this phenomenon specifically. And in that process, I noticed a considerable amount of debate over the question of whether CMC is more like spoken speech or more like written speech, or if it's a mixed modality. And I think CMC itself likely comprises multiple modalities because, like tweeting is different from instant message is different from live comments and so on. But in any case, I noticed a conspicuous lack of discourse around how CMC might be shaping spoken language. There's a lot of talk about how spoken language is shaping the way we communicate in written digital communication, but not the other way around. So I looked a little further into anyone talking about initialism specifically, and also thinking about how kind of this could contribute to, the existing discourse on CMC. So here are a couple of things that I found that might form like the theoretical framework that I analyze this data in using. The first is McSweeney. So she analyzes nearly 45,000 messages in the Spanish-English bilingual youth texts corpus. And she's exploring the specific ways that texters exploit the affordances of digital communication in order to communicate pragmatic information. All right, so she's looking at use of spelling, punctuation, and images like emoticons and emojis to this end. And she proposes 5 categories of respellings, that is words or phrases whose written representation diverges from prescriptive norms. And among these, she has the category of initialism, right? Let's see. However, McSweeney rejects the idea that non-standard orthographic features represent prosody. And the reason for that really hinges on her observation that initialisms, at least her claim that initialisms cannot be articulated, much less lengthened or stressed. So she gives the example of an initialism like this one here, WYD stands for what are you doing, that can host the feature of repeated letters or and actually, initialisms generally can host 2 of the features that the orthographic features that she investigates: capitalization or non-standard capitalization, as well as this repeated letters pattern. So her argument is basically, okay, these non-standard orthographic features are hosted by initialisms, but because initialisms cannot be spoken out loud, these non-standard orthographic features cannot be possibly representing or conveying prosody, okay? So this link between non-standard orthography and prosody is what I want to focus on. McCullough kind of accepts, at least, she seems more open to the idea that non-standard orthography can represent prosody. She acknowledges the link, albeit indirect, between orthography and prosody, especially in her chapter titled Typographical Tone of Voice. But really, it's Heath who makes this argument for prosody as the intervening mechanism between non-standard orthography or these orthographic features and meaning, whereas someone like McSweeney is working off a model that links non-standard orthography directly with pragmatic meaning, however, in a kind of loose and unsystematic way. So Heath uses corpus data from Twitter in judgment and production studies, and she's looking at non-standard capitalization, repeated letters, and non-standard uses of punctuation used in a systematic way to refer iconically to prosodic features of speech. So she says what the non-standard orthographic pattern used in a text refers to is not a specific meaning, but rather a set of prosodic features that the text would have if spoken aloud. And those prosodic features in turn are already systematically associated with pragmatic and semantic meanings. Okay, so finding evidence of initialisms being articulated out loud, I think, presents a challenge to McSweeney's analysis of non-standard orthographic features of CMC being directly linked with pragmatic meaning. And it also lends corroborating evidence to Heath's claim that non-standard orthographic features are interpreted as prosodic features, like pitch, loudness, and tempo, in a systematic way that are traditionally found in spoken speech and are themselves then linked with pragmatic and semantic interpretation. So if this research can contribute to the theoretical discourse in some way, this might be it. One more thing quickly I want to introduce in terms of like theoretical scaffolding is this notion of colloquialization, which is used by Mayer to refer to the narrowing of the gap between the norms of spoken and written English. So if we're just talking about the narrowing of the gap, excuse me, I think that's useful. However, Mayer uses this to talk specifically about the way that written English is affected by spoken English. Okay, so this is useful. I actually want to talk about the converse of colloquialization, something that we might call typographicalization. In other words, are we talking like we're tweeting? Are we talking like we're texting? Okay, so I want to introduce some examples today, as I said, primarily from one category of expression, initialisms. Initialisms that originated in CMC and then have crossed the boundary into the spoken lexicon. So I'm not talking about initialisms like WHO or TPP. I'm talking about initialisms like WTF, TLDR, IRL, and so on. And today I want to share some examples of these two in particular, WTF and TLDR. Okay, actually, and then there's one more category of expression or one more example I'd like to share at the end that might be analyzed as a construction or a meme. So not an initialism, but another form that originated in CMC, but is now observed in spoken speech. I'll move quickly through this. So there are numerous instances of lexical items referring to orthographic features of written text that have made their way or are making their way into the spoken lexicon. This is what I believe McCullough refers to as verbalizing punctuation. So probably a couple examples that you guys are all very familiar with. Period used interjectionally to emphasize the finality of the preceding statement. You don't do the work. Excuse me, if you don't put the work in, you will fail, period, right? Full stop. British English. More examples like ... again, in spoken speech. So in an interview with an author, the author says, and you know, ... the interviewer continues, off he goes. Okay. So let's look at a few examples. Here, I'm gonna start with WTF, which stands for what the fuck.
We watched it for 5 minutes, and there was 4 of us. And we all have the same story. We all saw the same stuff. We all came back and looked at each other and scratched our head and said, WTF, you know, I mean, serious? What was that?
Okay. Another example, I have a couple of UFO Easter eggs in this presentation, but don't take that too seriously. Okay, here's another example.
Feeling that existential dread whenever you have a couple of time. Might be experience about scary. Luckily, our partner for Sunday Scaries make the best ever CBD product. We turn those couple of TS into LOL.
Sorry, so that was a bit quieter. So this second example actually involves another instance of a lexical item that originated in CMC, but it's made its way into the spoken lexicon, LOL. However, even though LOL is extremely common in kind of online written communication, in fact, it appears in over 14% of the messages in the BYTS corpus, McSweeney excludes LOL from her category of initialism because the phrase it represents, laughing out loud, differs from its conventionalized meaning. Okay, so I have a lot of examples of LOL, but I didn't include them here because I'm not exactly sure how to analyze it. She instead analyzes it as a pragmatic particle that serves to clarify a message's illocutionary force. Okay, second set of examples I want to introduce involve the initialism TLDR, which stands for too long didn't read. And this was originally used to call out another user on the length of their post, like, hey, too long, I didn't read it. What do you want to say? However, in more courteous exchanges and serious discussions, TLDR can be self-invoked by the original poster as a disclaimer to the readers, like, I'm sorry, I said too much. And it's in this second sense that my examples are used. Okay, here's.
You recently released an episode of the podcast, for those with a shorter attention span, basically summarizing your position on free will. I think it was under an hour and a half.
Yeah.
It was brief and clear. So allow me to summarize the summary, TLDR, and maybe you tell me where I'm wrong.
Okay. Another example, this one isn't, there's a lot of context here, and it's not a grammatical utterance in English, but I think she just forgot to articulate some of the words here.
There is a new UFO report, Zachar in particular, but also I'll weigh in a little bit with what the TLDR is there.
So this is actually functioning, I think, syntactically in a different way than the previous examples, which is interesting, but I'll have to look at later. So lastly, as I mentioned, I want to introduce an expression that's not an initialism, but part of a class of expressions that originated in CMC to express the action of the author as narrated in the third person. And this specific expression is checks notes. It's alternatively referred to as a meme or a joke format because it basically functions to signal the preposterousness of a subsequent statement. And it's used for humorous effects, so people refer to it as a joke format. Actually, checks notes in its CMC incarnation was productive enough to even instigate some backlash in the popular press. But I imagine that it was like its widespread popularity online that made it kind of amenable to spoken speech, or a more likely candidate to then be used in spoken speech. So it sometimes takes the form of checks notes in square brackets. It's used to indicate that a person has paused what he is saying to make sure he is reading his notes correctly, because he can't quite believe what's coming out of his mouth. All right, so I have a few examples of this actually, but I'll just introduce one here.
But that he's like a plucky upstart who had wants to check notes, balance the budget, as though that's what's like galvanizing.
Okay. So what to do with all of these? Like I said, this is still a work in progress. So ideally, I'd like to get a lot more examples. And I prefer to do that using like a database of podcast transcripts rather than waiting till I come across them in my listening. Although I do have quite a fair few already just from listening and taking notes, which is, I think, to me, an indication that like something interesting is going on here. There are a couple of data sets I have in mind. One is a Spotify podcast data set that I don't have access to yet. I've applied, but waiting to hear back. And tape search, which I do have access to. The thing is, I'm not sure how best to go about this. These are AI generated transcripts. So there is a ton of data there. I'd also considered, feeding audio data into my own transcription software, Trint, I use to generate these podcast transcripts for my class. But I don't know about that method. This seems like I can compare the accuracy of those different kind of AI, of those different AI models or the way that they generate transcripts. But tape search, excuse me, just has a lot more data. However, to find examples still requires a lot of legwork, and it would be nice to find a way to kind of partially automate the search process, so you can go in and use keywords. You can, but then the results aren't tabulated in a really convenient form. I think ultimately it probably will require me going in and like looking at each of these examples to make sure that it's being used in the way that I really want to focus on. But in any case, what's left to do is find a way to maybe partially automate that search process using one of these expensive data sets. So things to do next: utilize a data set of AI-generated transcriptions to cull further examples, and maybe not limit it to initialisms. Like I'd like to check for things like checks, notes, or other memes or joke formats, perhaps. But I'm starting with initialisms. Maybe partially automate that search process. Also, I think for the kind of theoretical underpinning, I would like to take a look at maybe incorporating the notion of silent orality or digital orality into the theoretical framework. And also maybe compare, so I'm looking at podcasts specifically because, as I said, that's where I noticed this happening, not in my conversations with people, but maybe compare the frequency or use in podcasts with other forms or genres of spoken speech. Might be interesting down the road. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ashley. We've got plenty of time for discussion.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a work in progress. I don't have the study ready or the paper written, but do you guys have any, have you heard anything like this in your listening to podcasts, or maybe in your conversations?
I don't know.
Yes.
No, definitely, I hear it, and I wondered, I was really intrigued by some of the pragmatic differences that you began to allude to, and I wondered if you began to think about those, like with what TLDR was doing in those two different instances.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can go back. Let's see.
I was really
Right. So here TLDR seems to be kind of adhering to the this is just a definition from Know Your Meme, but this second sense, right? Like kind of as a disclaimer, or but in the same time, yeah, I'm not really. I don't know how I would analyze this. I guess what is too long, the original articulation of these ideas of his guest. So you think that's kind of an insult, right? But I think sometimes it's interesting, like and the reason why I think maybe these are occurring more in podcasts is because people podcasting essentially are talking online, right? Or even if it's not live conversation, it's going to go online. So I think there is a kind of general awareness that this is like, you are talking online. It is more, I think, that awareness is more prominent than, say, than in a conversation with a friend. Like this notion of like other people are going to be seeing this, and it's kind of similarity to like tweeting something or posting something on social media. So yeah, that is also something interesting to look into, like why is this occurring here? And then and then second example, this is just used, I think, as synonymously with like what the summary is, right? So here maybe this is more, I don't know too much about like the use of slang, or how slang is analyzed. But it seems like here this is a kind of just another way of saying what the summary is, but using language that signals, I'm an online person, right? To an online audience. Yeah.
I was gonna mention in Indonesian youth language, actually, some of these things get used quite a bit, and it's actually become core to the identity. There's an entire identity around the use of shortenings. It's called the Hasa Alai.
Huh.
And I don't know how much it's been written about in English.
Right.
But yeah, that was something that occurred to me. The other thing that occurred to me here, just looking at this, and I was just speculating, it's so interesting, and you presented it so well.
Oh, thank you.
I wondered, thinking about it in terms of, okay, well, is it a noun phrase? Does it occur at the start of the utterance or at the end of the utterance? Because, that kind of Elizabeth Traga kind of thing where, is it subjective? Is it intersubjective? Self-oriented, other-oriented? The other thing that occurred to me was Sylvia Sierra's work.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
It's millennial talk, and it looks at millennial talk through the perspective of intertextuality and the way that texts get carried from one context to the other for very specific social purposes. And it ties into what happens with memes and how memes become part of the everyday textual lives of millennials.
Wow, interesting.
It's good.
That would be a great, thing to look up and incorporate. Thank you very much.
But I love
No, we have time, and no, I need the suggestions, right? Because I'm just,
Well, from a methodological perspective, I think the obvious step would be to work out what you actually want to find out. Like, what is the actual research question that you're trying to address?
I guess
Operationalizing it, I think it would help you to figure out what the next steps are.
Well, it's like I'm curious how this model of like speech modalities is going to work with, like, does it work considering this evidence? So you have spoken speech, you have written speech, you have CMC that's supposed to be a mixed modality. So then do you have spoken speech that is informed by CMC that is another little mixed modality? Like this, the notion of kind of like these discrete categories of modalities, I'm not sure if that works well in this, considering and more of these examples. So it may necessitate a kind of newer, updated model to speech modalities.
Well, in this case, if this just means summary, then you just have a new word.
Sure. Yeah, this is not, I think, and it's not like initialisms are new to spoken speech, right? But I want to look specifically at, and not just initialisms, but ultimately there are forms of expression that originated, and that can be kind of determined to a pretty fair degree of reliability, originated in CMC and then are now occurring in spoken speech. So, because I have an intuition that people are, myself included, kind of like thinking and speaking as if they are posting to social media, as if they are tweeting or they're texting. Like those two modalities, I guess you might call them, are converging, but I don't know if it's beneficial to consider them even as discrete modalities that are affecting each other. Like there might need to be a much more complex, granted, but kind of comprehensive way of thinking about all of these, like integrated. That makes sense.
I was thinking that, jargon has, and particularly jargon and slang and all of these registers that you could call them, or styles, depending that they're connected with subgroups of particular groups of society. They've always been sources for the standard stuff. So you'd have to sort of say what would be different now, where you have fair enough, you obviously have a kind of style that is used in a particular area, and that's you use this as an additional tool,
right,
to bring that into everyday conversation.
I mean, would it be significant, or would it be meaningful to demonstrate that these types of expressions are occurring you know, to a significant degree more frequently in like podcasts versus spoken speech.
But that's to be expected, right? I mean, the audience.
Is it?
Well, if you have an audience, you're gonna use that jargon, that's dependent on the audience, right?
Mm,
You have two linguists talking. and
Sure.
Of course, you're gonna get a lot of linguistic jargon in there, and if you have a podcast that's for linguists, then of course, you're gonna get that type of jargon in there, right?
okay,
So you have
so
to sort of explain what would be the specific thing, why this is different.
maybe, well, maybe you know, people, you hear this expression like very online people,
Mhm.
right? So this maybe is some form of linguistic evidence to kind of define what that is. What is this group of people,
People
you know?
hear a lot online, but yeah, if people, let's say talk about football all the time,
Right,
there'll be a community there, you know.
Sure.
And they would be distinct in
Hmm.
terms of how they use different expressions and language. So maybe, you know, how would that be different from having a subculture like that?
I guess, like, I mean, this is a much bigger question. I'm not going to solve this in in the near time, but I think so. I don't think that people before just talking, whether it's with, you know, people that share, you know, a subculture or anyone else in any degree of formality, I'm not sure that they were aware in the past of that being turned into writing, or kind of the possibility that this might also exist in a written form. And I think that we're seeing a change in the way that people kind of conceptualize and then articulate their speech, their spoken speech, with a keen, albeit probably subconscious awareness that this is also kind of potentially occurring in written form, online. Yeah.
I think what you're suggesting here aligns really well with Gretchen McCullough's.
Yes.
Digital migrants,
Mhm.
you know, those waves of migrants.
Right.
It's almost like you could look at these different migrants and measure whether one or the other is using the forms or not.
I'm sorry, say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so digital migrants are essentially, I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but Gretchen has this theory that essentially the way that we went toward technology is not unlike the way that we actually migrate to different countries.
Right.
And if you look at the generations that actually migrated toward technology, you've got the most recent generation, young folks, who just haven't lived without it.
Right.
You know, you think about technology a particular way. If you go back to my parents' generation, they slowly migrated to it.
Right.
They were reluctant. But if you look at my generation, which is Generation X, we're weird. Like we
Right.
do it in different ways.
Mhm,
And Gretchen has a much better, more articulate argument about this because it's her idea.
Right.
But essentially that there are these migrants, and the wave of migration that you are toward technology actually impacts the degree to which you're taking up language or avoiding taking up some of the language. I'm sure
Right.
you can do much better with it.
No, but that's fascinating. Yeah, kind of applying some of the concepts of, yeah, exactly. I mean, speech communities that we think about in like a geographical sense, and the way that they, that like language contact occurs in that physical space, but in the digital space.
Very excited about what you're proposing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for
interesting
your
anyway.
suggestions.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.